All right, everyone. Welcome back to Masari's Unqualified Opinions. I'm Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiot. Have a very special episode today with someone that I've been a fan of for a while. I'm talking about Ben Hunt from Epsilon Theory. Ben is a wealth of fantastic macro commentary, of thoughtful economic thinking, has been early to cover the coronavirus, has been all over some of the dynamics at play with the federal government, not just here, but internationally, and some of the moral hazard the bailouts have created. He has at times opined on cryptocurrency. We're going to get into that and love to hear your latest and greatest thoughts and ideas as it pertains to Bitcoin and other crypto assets. But for those that are not frequent followers of your work, Ben, would you just be able to talk a little bit about Epsilon Theory, your background? You had a fantastic tweet when someone said, "Oh, well, how are you? what makes you an authority on this type of information?" And I don't want to step on your lines here or the punchline, but just that context for what is going to be an all-encompassing conversation, so people understand your perspective and why you are, in fact, maybe the perfect person to talk about in times where there is this perfect confluence of factors at both a macro and health level.
Well, first of all, Ryan, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to you and your audience. So, yeah, I mean, I hate these kind of appeals to authority, which our world is awash in these days, where you have to speak, as they talk about the Pope ex cathedra, from the big chair for anyone to take you seriously. Because the truth of all of this, right, and here I'm talking about the virus, its real life impact and the like. The truth of this is you don't need a PhD in, statistics and econometrics or epidemiology to understand the math here, right? This is high school math. It really is. And you just have to have a willingness, I think, to think with some autonomy about this. But the fact is, I do have a PhD, right, in econometrics, statistics from Harvard. I'm a defrocked member of academia. I was a professor for 10 years, and I left to start a computer company. So I'm, not in academia anymore, but I did the whole academic bit. I wrote a couple of books focused on econometric techniques, and my field was international politics. So my first foray into the virus was really trying to understand the statistics that were coming out from China. And, the skinny of that is that the statistics are, fucked. I mean, it's just nonsense what's been reported officially. And then the political science background, the international politics background was helpful, I think, in providing an alternative framework for understanding the narrative, as I like to call it, that China was constructing around the data, the numbers that they were reporting out of Wuhan, in particular, Hubei province, more generally, the whole of China, most broadly, and talk about the domestic political, I'll say, dynamics that really drove the narrative, the false narrative, my view, that they were projecting around both the confirmed cases and the death rate in China. And then from there, I think that background was similarly helpful in understanding, I think, the next part of the story, which was analyzing, again, my view, false narratives that came out of the World Health Organization, particularly early on in their, I'll say, coverage of the novel coronavirus and COVID-19. And then most recently, I think it's been useful in trying to understand. Again, it's not, I think, at the level of mendacity that we've seen out of both China and the World Health Organization, but understanding the narratives that have come out of the U.S. other Western attempts to do that, I think is not terribly helpful.
You talk about this quite a bit in one of your most recent posts, Once in a Lifetime. This is just a couple of days ago, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very timely. And you don't mince any words in the intro. We are led by high functioning sociopaths in our politics and our economy, and nowhere is this more apparent than in a war against COVID-19. And then you go on to explain, this isn't an identity politics thing. It's about power. You've gone so far on Twitter. Burn it all down.
Yes.
And there's absolutely a strong element of that frustration that it seems to be bubbling up, and many of us that have been following this virus have kind of been waiting for it, and we're starting to see a lot of what we feared would happen. But at the same time, it seems like that is still in its earliest state, because most people have still not caught up to the magnitude of this. It's still an inconvenience. It's still what's happening in New York is scary, or what's happening in Italy is scary. It's not what's happening to me in my neighborhood and community is scary. And so one of the really interesting points that you made in this post, using the poker analogy and understanding whether you have to get dealt one hand for the rest of your life, or whether you're just grinding it out and playing the percentages on a night in, night out basis, and the difference in decision making that you need to the different process you need to go through in scenarios like this. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that post? Because it was definitely you always write with your own personality and voice, but it was a personal note, and
it was.
and much different than some of your economic posts.
That's true. There are really two parts to it. The first was, I'll call it a call for empathy. Because when I say that we are led by high-functioning sociopaths, I really mean that in a clinical sense. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, if you can believe that. A sociopath is defined as someone who can compartmentalize anything, or that really does not have a feeling or connection, a feeling of empathy with anyone else. They wear a series of masks, really, and a high-functioning sociopath is someone who's learned to put on the right mask for the right situation. I say this because I started a software company, sold that, and then I got into the investments world, where I ran a hedge fund for a lot of years. And I'll tell you, the most successful people on Wall Street, whether it's hedge funds or the big banks and the like, they are, without exception, high-functioning sociopaths. And it's an enormous advantage in these situations, right? That you're able to compartmentalize, where what happened yesterday means nothing. Today is a new day, of fresh slate. Your relationship with people means nothing. It's just, right, what's in it for me right now. And what I've discovered over the last 10 years is that same high-functioning sociopathy applies to politics as well. And as you mentioned, this isn't a left versus right thing. It's not a Republican versus Democrat thing. It's not a Boomer versus Gen Z thing. It's a power thing. It really is. And we have a system today that I think is designed, a system of economics, system of politics, that rewards high-functioning sociopathy, right? It penalizes any sense of empathy, any sense of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So that was the first part of the note, is just asking for people to recognize that, and that so much of what we are told, what we're asked to believe from our political and our economic leaders today, is a form of sociopathy, meaning that the fragmentation that I think we all feel in both our political lives, our investing lives, the what I like to call the widening gyre that we all experience, where the polarization that is as endemic as the novel coronavirus, it doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't just get better on its own. And when we are told that our policy towards the virus should change depending on whether it affects old people more than young people, whether it affects people with quote unquote pre-existing conditions rather than other people. I mean, Ryan, you mentioned yourself, you've got asthma, right? I mean, so with a lot of the drum beating that we have today, right, you are presented as lesser, right? And I mean this quite seriously, that your life is worth less in our expected utility calculation of how we should, combat the virus. And that really leads me to my second point, which is, well, if we reject that, again, what I would characterize as sociopathy, this notion that we can and should make utility maximizing decisions, based on, oh, well, this person had a pre-existing condition, or this person is 70 years old, so, if they live, they live, they die, they die, right? I mean, this is madness. This is madness. And so what's incumbent on us, though, is to present an alternative form of making decisions. And that's what I tried to lay out in this note, because we are so well trained, for good reasons, to use what I would describe as a utility maximization decision-making approach, right? And we do this in investing. We do this so many times in our lives. We certainly do it in gambling, right? It's that what you're trying to calculate is what's your edge and what are the odds. Mm-hmm. You're trying to calculate, all right, well, if I'm playing craps, I roll the dice, I can tell you exactly what odds there are for any, combination of the pips to come up, what number I'm going to roll. Or if I'm, playing blackjack, I can tell you, all right, what are the odds that, this card is going to, the dealer is going to turn over this card. Well, that all works, and we can calculate odds. And so, do we press a bet? Do we playing poker? Do I, what's my bet here? What's my strategy here? Because the assumption is that we're going to play these games multiple times, right? That the whole notion of calculating probabilities and expected outcomes, it makes sense if the market's going to open tomorrow, if the poker game's going to play on and on. It's all based on that assumption. If you take that assumption away, though, and I believe you have to take that assumption away when you're dealing with a freaking pandemic, right, and the impact on society that it has, well, you have to have a different approach to making decisions. And the decision structure that I'm recommending, it goes by the name of mini-max regret. That's an abbreviation for minimizing your maximum regret. You're not trying to maximize your utility. You're trying to minimize your maximum regret. And it's, you can be mathematical about this. This is something that was formalized in the 1950s, and it's a core aspect of what we today call behavioral economics. There's a guy named Jimmy Savage, right? Which is a great name. Sounds like he should be on Tiger King. Jimmy Savage. Fascinating dude. I mean, he was like the Zelig character, the Woody Allen character, who was always in the background of important things that happen in science. He was with John von Neumann, the inventor of game theory, really. Mm-hmm. In World War II, they were cracking codes together in World War II. These giants of economic theory today, they all worked with this guy, Jimmy Savage. But, Jimmy died pretty young, in his early 50s, and so he's not well known, but he was really the first one to really write seriously about this idea of mini-max regret. And so here's the way it works. So basically the idea of mini-max regret is, look, if you're only going to play the game once, thinking in terms of probabilities doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because, again, to use your example of poker, let's say I'm dealt this one hand of poker, and it's the only hand of poker I'm going to be dealt my entire life. I need to bet that differently. I need to think about probabilities differently. If it's the one hand of poker I will play my entire life, versus if I'm going to be, like you say, grinding it out and playing 500 hands a night every night. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we all get it, right? It's that if we catch an unlucky break and we're only playing the hand once, we have no opportunity for the odds to work in our favor over time. We have no opportunity for the odds to even out. And so we really can't think in terms of odds, in terms of probabilities if we're going to play the hand once. We have to think in terms of just not expected utility, right? But just utility. How does it make us feel, right? You get to roll the dice one time. Place your bet now, but you're only going to roll those dice one time. How would you feel if it turns out snake eyes, right? How would it feel? And so the way minimax regret theory works is, all right, what are the possible outcomes from my decision? Let's say I've got, it's a simple decision. I either do something or I don't do something. If I do something, let's say I've got 3 outcomes. Again, I'm not assigning probabilities to them. I mean, they have to be real possible outcomes. I'm not going to say, oh, one possible outcome is, a meteor comes tomorrow and blows up the earth. I mean, that's not something I want to create, put forward as one of the possibilities. But I've got 3 possibilities that are non-trivial. It could happen. And for doing nothing, I've also say, I've got 3 possible outcomes, non-trivial outcomes. Well, minimax regret theory says, okay, look at those 2 decision trees and look at the 3 branches that are on each tree. Of the 6 branches in total, which one would you hate the most, right? Which one, if it happened, would you go, okay, I can't live with that. That's my maximum regret. And minimax regret theory says, okay, well, don't do that, right? Don't go down that decision tree that has that worst outcome, your maximum regret on that decision tree. Do anything but that. Now, technically what that means is, if you're modeling this out, you take, all right, here are my different decision trees. I want to choose the decision tree that has the best worst outcome. Right? That's how it works out. What decision tree has the best worst outcome? Because any decision you could make, any action you could take, is going to have some good outcomes. It's going to have some bad outcomes. Minimax regret says, forget the odds. Choose the action that has the best worst outcome. And I think that's how we have to think about so many things in life, right? It doesn't just go for national policy in a pandemic. It has around what do I want to spend my life doing? What's my profession or my vocation? You have to think about. Look, it absolutely has a lot to do with how you might think about cryptocurrencies and the like. Because when we're talking about minimax regret, that word is regret. It's not maximum loss. You're not trying to minimize your maximum loss. You're trying to think, what is my maximum regret? And what I love about, I call it the crypto community, to use an all-encompassing
very loose term, yeah.
A very loose term, right? Very loose term. And I recognize the looseness of the term, but what the common denominator that I find that I love about really almost everyone I've ever met who's been involved in this movement, because I'm going to call it a movement, is that their maximum regret is not, oh, I didn't make the most money, or I didn't, do this. It's not kind of a sense of loss. It's like my maximum regret would be not being part of this.
Yes.
So I find so many people that are part of a movement that they have internalized, maybe they haven't formally, gone through the calculations of minimax regret, but I find that so many people who believe strongly in something and are part of what I'll call as a movement, they've internalized this process. They know what I'm talking about when I say that the big decisions, what you have to avoid is your maximum regret. And that is, again, not just for national policy, it's for the way we live our own lives. So that's why I think it's such a powerful way of thinking about the really important decisions we make in our life. For policy, I think it's empathy. understanding that others are autonomous human beings and just should be treated the way you would want to be treated. But for these big decisions, I think the structure of minimax regret is very powerful.
So you touched on something that I think kind of drives at one reason that many in the crypto community may have been early to appreciate the magnitude of the coronavirus threat and kind of how it's informed some of our thinking around how restrictive the response should be, how aggressive the response should be. To a certain extent, this applies more broadly to all of your other writing as well about the financialization of the world and the easy money malinvestment that's been created, the moral hazard that's kind of spread, a lot of it, the long tail effect of the recovery efforts around the bailout, and now the plunge protection team that will not allow the markets to go below a certain threshold because that is the KPI for most of our leaders, certainly this administration in the U.S. When you think about what comes next, we'll go back to the burn it all down headline, that we can get people, tuned in for the clickbait purposes. There's an element of truth to it, but there's also an element of inevitability. And it strikes me that the three communities, the three trends are not that different, right? Bitcoin is a response to everything that we've seen in the global financial markets. The coronavirus might be the pin that pops the balloon, but that doesn't mean that it's the response that is the ultimate culprit for everything that's gotten wrong systemically. How do you think about what comes next, right? So how does your mental model evolve, given that you've already had some of these core theses? And I don't want to go so far as to call you a perma bearer, but it's
no, I'm not. I'm not at all.
But more someone that recognizes like a structural imbalance is ultimately going to have to get corrected. And now is the time where all of that seems to be coming to a head. But just what, if anything, has changed about your view of the world or your mental model for what happens next from a macro standpoint?
Well, and I'll try to approach this from a couple of different directions that I think will be relevant to the questions you're asking, and I think a lot of your listeners for this podcast. One of the things I admire so much about the community that you're part of is the focus on a permissionless, on a bottom-up, a decentralized notion of reorganization of not just our system of money, but society. And it is so much in keeping with my core philosophy, which is, I'll call it small L liberalism, which is liberty and justice for all. Right? Imagine that. Imagine that, right? Mm-hmm. Autonomous human beings that are treated not as means to an end, but as autonomous human beings. What I'd also say, though, from a life of working in and around narratives, in and around Wall Street in particular, I'll say the corridors of power, the sinews of power, is that while I think that a bottom-up decentralized approach is the only lasting approach to making real change in a society, I would also say that the empire always strikes back, and that this is not you have to be willing to play the long game. And by the long game, I mean longer than my lifetime, right? I mean, this is the fundamental shifts of society to what I think is more, not just productive, but more human. I certainly don't expect to see in my lifetime. As I've been in Wall Street for a long time, and a year and a half ago, my partner Rusty Gwynn and I, we spun out from our asset management firm, and we started our own company. We named it Second Foundation Partners. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a direct nod to the Isaac Asimov Foundation trilogy. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, it's around what Asimov called the study of psychohistory, right? The way that narratives are used by people in power to shape the future, shape human behavior. If you watch Westworld, right, there's psychohistory for you, right? That the system is managing. So the goal of the founders of Second Foundation in the trilogy was not to prevent what they called kind of this galactic dark age, right? But was to shorten the dark ages from 10,000 years to only 1,000 years. Right? So, you look at I'll call it the fall of Rome going into the Dark Ages, right? That this wasn't an event. This wasn't happening over a year or two. This took centuries. And I don't know, it takes centuries. That's not what I necessarily mean by the long game. But what I do mean very much is that it requires a very long perspective, longer certainly than my lifetime. And I'm 55, which doesn't feel too old right now. Mm-hmm. But this is something that is so powerful for my children and their children that it's something I'm willing to devote my life to. My maximum regret would be not working for the eventual, I'll say, reestablishment of what I like to call the small L liberal virtues, also the small C conservative virtues of family and of honor, right? And shame. Honor and shame are two sides of the same coin. It's those small L liberal virtues, those small C conservative virtues that I think can and will be built from a bottom-up perspective. It's not going to come from the top down. It comes from the bottom up. But I think we have to play a really long game here. And this gets back to my initial and still fundamental criticism of, again, I'll call it crypto, right? Which is that so long as the end-all and be-all is money, right? It's very hard to win that battle, much less the larger war with the power structure that we have today. So that's my concern. It's not necessarily a fatal flaw, because I think that that notion of being part of a movement and thinking about this as being larger than just money is what drives so many people in this community that you speak to. I think that really is the answer. My beef, I think, is more with tactics than with strategy, if you will. So that was a really long-winded answer to your deceptively simple question, but that's where I think we are.
No, I mean it's helpful. I get the gist. I think there's two ways to look at money. There's long-term savings, and there's kind of what you spend it on day to day. For super long period of time and extremely short period of time, Bitcoin is exceptional money. It's every time period in between that it isn't that great, right? And that's true for tax reasons. That's true for just user experience reasons. There are a ton of things that make Bitcoin and crypto assets just very cumbersome to actually use for any period of time other than instantaneous, and then kind of super long term for the digital gold use case. But the interim volatility, you could argue, is what makes Bitcoin so interesting at both extremes, because you basically have this natural bifurcation of the super long-term investors, the ones that are going to prop up the monetary base, the ones that are ultimately responsible for the system getting liquid enough that it could handle all of the tiny liquid instantaneous transactions over time. And everything in the middle, you kind of weed out the riffraff, the tourists, because they come in during a parabolic upslope and then they get decimated when the market corrects. And then what is left are, basically the cycles of true believers that come into the industry full time and actually start building out the infrastructure and tools to kind of build a parallel system that ultimately, some emerging economies at first might be able to latch onto. I don't expect it to be the U.S. at first. It's probably going to be smaller markets at first. And the end result is there is some decentralized life raft, because the alternatives look pretty bleak. It's either, kind of super nationalist America that's gradually closing its borders, whose, dollar denominated, reserve status is diminishing. It's China, which is an outright authoritarian regime that is already well known. And it's the euro, which seems like it's on the brink of balkanization anyway, because there are so many misaligned incentives between the member states. So, there's a broader question of if not this, then what? And if not now, then when? And even though crypto is imperfect, it doesn't seem like you're going to get a set of conditions more conducive to actually growing the utility here versus, just the community, element. I could make the case that, yes, maybe you're right. The first decade, give or take, was about the ethos and the community development and maybe some of the very basic infrastructure. But if this next decade isn't about the parallel financial system that it creates, then something has gone very, very wrong.
So, Ryan, I hope with all my heart you're right, and I mean that, and I am, I'm just a fan of that vision you laid out. But we'll do everything in my power to support it. But you can tell there's a but coming, right? Right, and
that's why we're having this conversation.
Right, exactly, right. The but is that, I've seen in my own lifetime so many episodes. I'm really at a loss for words. I don't know. I'll call it an episode, but there really are tragedies, right? Of where movements that decide, or that movements that become entranced by the promise of money. Because I don't know, once you start dealing with the realm of money, it's so hard, I think, to disentangle that from each individual participant's desire to make money. And then once it gets immersed in the world of money, of financial innovation, the resources, the ingenuity, the ability of states to co-opt that movement is breathtaking. And it's not just done with sticks. It's not just done by, we're going to ban this or we're going to do this. It's done with sticks. It's done with carrots. And this is something that's been going on for thousands of years. This is not a modern, thing of co-opting movements that get involved with money. And so that's my core reticence about everything you described, which I'm not just rooting for. I'll do everything I can to help it. But I've seen it in my own lifetime. I think you see examples of it today, that if it becomes a big enough movement to make a difference for how money is considered by the mass of people, then governments and their major corporate sponsors, right? They will not stop at anything to co-opt this, because this is why governments exist. This is their existential issue, is to tax, is to extract money, and because it's existential, I keep going back to, I'm not a religious guy at all, but the advice that Jesus said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and what is Caesar's is money. That's his, man. And, render unto God, render unto us. I've got a secular view of us. What is ours? What is ours? Ours is our data. What I read, where I go, who I associate with, what I say, right? What is ours? What's mine is my vote, right? I want to take that back, right? What is mine? Mine is my autonomy of mind. My ability to not be manipulated in what I think, not to be inundated with an ocean of narrative that is trying to get me to behave in a certain way. That we're definitely allies in this, Ryan. I just, my focus, I want to try to focus on those things that I just mentioned, whether it's data, it's speech, and the like, and taking that back. Mm-hmm. Because I've just seen so many times financial innovation be co-opted through massively powerful carrots and sticks.
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly valid concern. The slightly different take would be you're not rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, because you're not talking about US dollars, you're not talking about RMB, you're not talking about yen. What you're talking about is exit. And what's interesting is we live in a world where there is no uncharted territory anymore. And the only land that you could exit to would be, the digital realm, right? Where there's infinite space, it hasn't been settled, and a digital currency should be the currency of the digital realm, or at least the one that ultimately acts as a Schelling point for anyone online. And it's not necessarily.
Ryan, let me interrupt. I just got to interrupt you. Let's say that some enormous resource, something of value, was discovered on Antarctica, right? Mm-hmm. Or on the moon, right? You don't think that nation states would carve up Antarctica tomorrow, right? If there was some enormous resource or something of value that could be extracted there, or from the moon, right? And the reason I say that is that if there is nothing of value, if it's not a store of value, if there's not value associated with Bitcoin, then you're right. It can go on being, unregulated and be on its own accord forever. But at the point where it becomes, my wealth is here, and the wealth that the government wants a chunk of is in Bitcoin. What is it in human history that makes you think that the monopoly of violence that governments have will not be used to carve that up for a claim of sovereignty over that?
Well, you'd have to physically escape and live in some free state where you would not be constantly fearful of overarching surveillance of your every move. Basically, what we have in the West and East alike is just ubiquitous surveillance and data ownership by another name, whether it's the government or the data monopolies. But if you could somehow put yourself in a situation where you were physically free and conducting most of your day-to-day life in a purely digital realm that didn't necessarily have borders, that might be a path for exit. And it might be more viable as certain nations rise and fall, because there's always going to be weak nations and weak governments that won't have the same mechanisms to coordinate their efforts and actually exercise their monopoly on violence effectively, which maybe opens up the equivalent of like North America in the 1700s, right? That's the only real viable exit that you have. People are talking about seasteading. That's never going to happen. Maybe it will. I don't know. But exiting to the digital realm seems much, much more interesting, compelling, and ultimately feasible with the more tools that are created in encryption, in digital money, in mesh networking, and all these things that are not there yet, but are getting built. And I think that's got to be where the puck is going, and where people are building around, or it's just you kind of throw up your hands and okay, well, what the fuck are we here for, right? Like what are we? We're just running up the down escalator.
No, I think there are real possibilities of creating communities of distributed trust, right? Which is at the core of the in my mind the whole effort, right? How do you create a community of distributed trust? And what I'd like to see is that distributed trust is applied to areas that are not so fiercely guarded by the you know the powerful states, governments, and businesses, right? Because again, when I think about how to play the long game here, I think that it's possible to carve out areas of, I'll call it resistance, but what I really mean is areas of sovereignty, self-sovereignty over issues, again, that are not so fiercely guarded as money is by the state. And so, again, this is an issue of tactics rather than strategy, right? Mm-hmm. And so that I would pursue a different tactical approach to I think the goal we all, or most of your listeners share with you and I, for sure. Right? It does seem to me, and I want to bring this back to the coronavirus now, right? Which is that everything you're describing, whether it's your tactical approach, my tactical approach, I think it's tempting to think, oh, the instability that the virus brings is going to be an advantage in fighting this long game, right? I actually think it's very much disadvantageous to both of us, right? To both of our tactical approaches here. And I don't think you have to look much farther than what happened in Hungary, right, over the last 2 days, where the Hungarian parliament, and this has been building for a while, right? But the Hungarian parliament, in response to the coronavirus emergency, and it is an emergency, gave really dictatorial powers to Viktor Orban, the prime minister, where he now has the ability to rule by decree, right? Don't have to pass a law, doesn't have to go through parliament. Whatever the executive says is law. There's no time limit on this now in Hungary. There's a new law that if you spread false information, right, fake news, as the executive describes as what is fake or not, you're in prison for 5 years. And if you try to leave the areas of confinement, quarantine that they've set up, that's an 8 year. This is what happens, I think, in weaker states. Go back to some, idyllic state of nature where, you can set up your, kingdom of Wakanda, right? What happens is they're taken over by thugs. They're taken over by warlords and by thugs. And in Hungary it's a member of the EU. I mean, it's a core member of Europe. So when I think about what's going to happen in the next year and a half in Indonesia, what's going to happen in the next year and a half in Egypt, what's going to happen today, what's happening right now in Iran, for God's sake, I don't think it works to our advantage. Right? I think that the impetus in every country, and particularly in the weaker states, is going to be for a reclaiming of the physical, of the violence, of the gun. And so this is why I think it's more important than ever that we identify each other in our communities of empathy, in our communities of our pack, right? So that we can fight this long game, this long war, and so we can support each other. So anyway, that's not, I'm just trying to bring it back to what's happening today, and how we should think about this. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a great opportunity, but I think it's something that we all need to come together even more around so that we can stay strong for the dark times that are ahead. And I do think there are dark times.
Never one to mince words, and I certainly appreciate the perspective. I'm slightly more optimistic for the reasons that I outlined, maybe not in the physical realm, but in the digital realm, right? Is the internet still a bastion of freedom, and can you ultimately get people to act freely outside of some of the more restrictive social media platforms, for instance, but just any type of peer-to-peer communication system, peer-to-peer digital realms would seem to be more conducive for the silent resistance, the quiet resistance, and the sovereign individual thesis. But how exactly we get there, not debating that it could get ugly. I want to change gears for the last little bit that we have and just talk about your understanding of the investment, zeitgeist for this generation of investors. Because one of your more popular posts, this is water, and yeah, it's still water. I kind of talk about this shifting mindset where deflation expectations that were driven by technology are now inflation expectations. There's, and this isn't necessarily new, but I like the way that you laid it out. The globalism that had permeated the macro economy for so long is now becoming more nationalistic. In some respects, that's not a bad thing, because now you might have countries that are more resilient in the face of issues like pandemics. When today, we're seeing just how levered we are via global supply chains. You talked about the kind of shifting from capital markets into true market mechanisms to just political utilities, and then just overall how financialization has kind of exacerbated all of those trends. What's the next step in financial markets, right? If you run out of the capacity to print, if you run out of the capacity to spend, let's not even talk about the U.S. Let's talk about some country like Hungary. They don't necessarily control their own currency. It's a small but usually functioning democracy. What does a market system look like in a situation like Hungary? And how do you ever get back to normalcy, or how do you set the reset button?
So the short answer is that I'll go back to, I'm going to go back 2,500 years. yeah. This is the academic in me, right? I can't give you a straight answer, right? What you're asking has all happened before, my friend. It's all happened before, right? So Peloponnesian War, you've got Athens and Sparta, the big countries, fighting each other. And then the question is, well, what happens to the little countries? What happens to, Megara, all these little city-states? And the Athenians, they're trying to get their allies together. And one of the little allies is saying, well, but you're asking us to sacrifice everything. It's all for you. I mean, this doesn't sound like a great deal. And the Athenian ambassador says, it was ever thus, the strong do as they will, the weak do as they must. Strong do as they will, the weak do as they must. And nothing has changed in 2,500 freaking years when it comes to the ability of countries to chart their own course, to deal with the exigencies of power. Hungary will do as they must. Even weaker countries than Hungary will definitely do as they must, and the strong do as they will. So what they will, when it comes to Europe, when it comes to the United States, when it comes to Japan, when it comes to China, is that there are no limits on, print or go burr, right? Mm-hmm. There are no limits on, we haven't even really touched yet modern monetary theory and the notion that, there's not even a relationship between spending and taxing, right? You can run deficits as much as you want. Go on, go for it. We're just getting started, man. It's just getting started. Right? We're not at the end game of this. We're it's like this is halftime. Right? This isn't the last few minutes of the fourth quarter with how governments are going to transform capital markets into political utilities, with how they're going to, transform the meaning of money into what supports political power. Man, this is just halftime. So I think we really do have to take that long-term perspective that the printer can go burr for a lot longer, and it doesn't matter who gets elected. It's all the same. The last 10 years have been the greatest transfer of wealth to, I call it the managerial class, than I really think anything in history. And it's come through stock buybacks, through stock sales, through stock-based compensation. It's all happened in the last 10 years, and it's a transfer of hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth to managers, not entrepreneurs, not founders, not genius, to managers, And when that much wealth is transferred to that number of people in such a short period of time, it doesn't reverse itself. People don't. The cheese may move, but people still want their cheese. Yeah, and I just think it's so important to remember that we really are playing that long game. To remember that the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must, and to have in mind the set that we're just halftime right now, and that we need to play the game accordingly. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to storm an entrenched machine gun nest, with, huzzah, and now's our time. You really do, I think, want to play the long game. I think there's a real power of conviction and belief that allows us to play a long game. And to keep it all together requires people like you doing your podcast. It requires people like me doing our writing. And most of it all, it requires a critical mass of people whose greatest regret would be to give up and to be co-opted by the powers that be, rather than play the long game and fight the long fight.
I can't think of a better way to wrap up this conversation than calling for conviction and long-termism in a market where everybody's panicked and short-termism generally rules the day. Ben, where can people find you on Twitter?
I'm easy. It's all Epsilon Theory all the time. So at Epsilon Theory and epsilontheory.com. It's free to read, and love to have you on board.
It's an excellent read always. I've been following you for years now, and definitely appreciate your commentary and watching it evolve even as we get into a slightly darker period. And you can tell, for those that are tuning in, if you can hear the background noise, that nap time just ended. So we just wrapped up at the most perfect time, because I just heard my kids wake up, and surprised that they haven't run in here already.
Love it. Thank you for having me, Ryan. It's really a pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you, Ben, and stay safe.
You too.
Take care.